Um, so hopefully you can all have access to the meeting notes, which has an agenda in it. If you haven't already, please sign in and let me know if you have any trouble. But what we wanted to do today was to talk to you about a proposed working group under the auspices of the Global Open Research Commons Interest Group. Can you go ahead and advance to the next slide, Mark? And I'll just go over quickly. Those of you, probably a lot of you here, I know I saw you earlier this week in the interest group meeting for the Global Open Research Commons. But essentially the interest group is, the idea behind the interest group is that we are witnessing digital research resources being built across the globe, either nationally, pan-nationally, or in different domains. And the interest group is attempting to coordinate the development of those commons and the outputs of those commons. The interest group builds on and incorporates previous National Data Services interest group that some of you may have been involved in. One of the things that they're working on is a definition and a framework to describe commons. We're testing out, we tested out this week, a definition of the commons, which is digital resources for the common good. It's an idea of a global trusted system of systems providing access to research resources. And one of the deliverables that they are also working on, in addition to this sort of typology of commons and definition of commons, is a roadmap for a global alignment to help developers set priorities for commons developments and integration. And so in support of this roadmap, we had decided that it could be beneficial to have an interest group that focused on benchmarking. Mark, next slide. The idea of benchmarking is that, in general, is that it's a process of comparing an organization's processes and performance metrics to best practices from other organizations or industries' best standard practices as a way of making meaningful contributions to others and identifying areas where we can improve. So benchmarking helps organizations identify the gaps between the state of their existing infrastructure or services, the current organizational maturity, and then where they want to be. It helps us identify potential areas of collaboration with other organizations so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel or provide any redundant services. I also think that they're very helpful in creating either strategic or implementation level plans that support user workflows or specific use cases. Next slide, Mark. And so as part of this idea about creating a working group on benchmarking, we have drafted a case statement that's open for review. And I'm going to pop a link into the chat window that allows you, it should allow everyone to comment on the case statement. And I should note that everything that I'm saying here in this presentation and in the case statement, these are all open for community review. What we're doing here today is trying to gauge an interest in the working group as we have envisioned it and get some feedback on how we might approach it. So the draft case statement, I'm going to go through a high-level overview, but it begins by laying out the rationale that I just spoke about. The idea that there are global commons being developed, that we want to create a roadmap for those commons, that a set of benchmarks could be useful for that. It could be useful to both the individuals who are building the commons and people that are working, trying to coordinate the commons as well. And so next slide, Mark. What the case statement does a number of different things. One of the things that we did was create a preliminary list of the commons that we would want to include in this analysis. And so, you know, as I said before, the Global Open Research Commons is being built by national, pan-national, domain-specific organizations, European Open Science Cloud, African Open Science Platform, International Virtual Observatory Alliance. All of these organizations have done a tremendous amount of really interesting work, and we would want to survey them and extract some information from them. Next slide, Mark. So we were envisioning two deliverables from this working group. One would be a non-redundant set of key performance indicators or KPIs and success metrics currently either utilized or planned or desired from the existing science commons. So what we're looking for here is how existing commons are measuring their success or adoption or engagement of their services. And so we could imagine something like number of data downloads, or the number of software commits, or the number of HPC cycles used within a month, similar sorts of KPI and access statistics. So that would be one set. Next slide, Mark. One deliverable, rather. The second deliverable that we were envisioning is a curated set of benchmarks that allow Commons developers to compare features across the clouds. So the first set is a KPI focused internally to the organization, and the second deliverable would be a set of benchmarks that allow us to compare features across Commons. And so in this case, there's a huge range of things that you could imagine, either evidence or existence of a well-defined decision-making process could be a benchmark, a consistent and openly available data privacy policy, federated authentication and authorization infrastructure, community-supported and well-documented metadata standards, workflows for adding and maintaining persistent identifiers to managed assets, mechanisms for utilizing vocabulary services and publishing to the semantic web, an open catalog of all of the artifacts and services that's provided, a proven workflow to connect multiple different research artifact types like data and publications, or data and electronic library notebooks, sort of those science graph, PID graph sorts of questions, mechanisms for capturing provenience, any number of things. So the idea is that there would be this set of desirable benchmarks that might be included in the common. Go ahead, next slide, Mark. And again, not set in stone, but we were proposing as a potential work plan might look something like this. Creating a target list of commons to make sure that we've gotten all the organizations that we want to review. Review the public-facing documentation of each of the commons to extract key performance indicators and benchmarking information. Review public-facing documentation of related recommendations and roadmaps from related communities. We know that there's been a lot of really good work done in RDA and other groups, position papers available in the wider scientific infrastructure community. This includes some of the good work, for example, on the fair metrics for data services or data sets. We would want to conduct outreach to the commons. After doing that sort of literature review section, we'd want to conduct outreach to the commons representatives and related organizations to fill in any gaps that we might have. And then synthesize those, all this review into the two documents for benchmarks and KPIs. Next slide, Mark. So, and again, just as a straw man sort of argument, we could imagine that we would be using now until the end of December to format the group if there's an interest in a desire to move forward. We would have meetings to decide on the agreement of the scope of work and the deliverables and the approach. Review the case statement, include any remarks that are included there, and create sub-working groups. I could imagine, rather than having all members of the working group involved in all of those subtasks, I could imagine there'd be subtask working groups. We could do that either by having a work group on the deliverable for the KPI and a different subtask group on the deliverable for benchmarks. We could do it by domain. We could do it by a topology of the commons. We could do it by service type. We could do it by time zone so that people could meet at a reasonable hour because, you know, we're all on Zoom these days. So there's any number of ways that the group could organize itself, but that would be something that we could discuss. Beginning in January, we could begin the literature review with an idea of having an update at RDA 17, and then hopefully working towards a first draft of the benchmark outputs either around October. That could happen simultaneously, depending on how the working group is organized. You can imagine that the drafts could come together or they could come separately, with an idea that the working group wouldn't last beyond April 2022. And so last slide, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Mark. Okay, yep. So so that's a large overview, and I think we're going to stop there and take any questions you might have about the group. But if there is a consensus to proceed, then I'm anticipating that the working group is going to meet monthly over Zoom at a time to be determined by all. And so I'm looking at the chat right now. D2 seems to cover a variety of things, technical and human standards. Yep, we would have to be absolutely careful about those descriptions. Mark, I agree with that. Would the structure align with the stack described on Tuesday? Maybe the stack organize other artifacts, KPIs, metrics. Mark, do you want to speak to that? I'm not sure I'm quite following.
Well, I guess my thought on that is that there are, so for example, let's think, I don't know how many people were involved in Tuesday's interest group meeting, but a stack for a global open research commons was presented. It also had and I'm making an arm gesture, I can't get my video to turn on fast enough to share that with you, but basically there was a circle going around the whole thing that encompassed things like governance and so on. It might be helpful to map the different bits and pieces, metrics, KPIs, specific services, both technical and functional, interoperability standards, et cetera. They may live at different places in that diagram. And if they can't be mapped to that diagram, it may be important to think about the diagram a bit, just to make sure we're, you know, properly characterizing the bits and pieces that are being identified and benchmarked. It'll just help to kind of what's the word? Ground the work in a structure. It's just a thought that comes through my mind as I'm thinking about the work that might be needed and what might come out of it.
So that's interesting. I think that, and I was at the group on Tuesday. And when you say the word stack, I tend to think of it in a technology point of view, where, you know, you talk about very specifically about the back end, the engine, the user interface. I think the topology was more about the components of the cloud, of the research commons, rather. If that's what you're referring to as the stack.
Well, it was presented by Sarah as sort of the desire, and maybe Andrew will fix all of our language here.
Andrew will absolutely not fix all of your language. And I am only partway. I didn't attend that session because it started at 2:30 in the morning for me, and I'm old and weak. But I'm partway through reviewing the video. I think, Mark, the stack you're referring to is the diagram that we borrowed from the NIH, which has a technology stack in the middle. So I'm now doing the pan thing. Okay. And then it had the governance, and I'm blanking on the other things, but there were things wrapped around the technology stack. And I agree with Mark that it would be helpful if the way the interest group is describing the problem and the way the working group is tackling the benchmarking piece hung off the same underlying concept. And in fact, what we might find, and this only occurred to me when Mark asked the question, what we might find is that the task of doing the benchmarking identifies elements that we should be calling out in the overall diagram. That we might say, oh, we really want to benchmark this. That doesn't fit anywhere in the way we're currently describing the commons in the diagram. Maybe that's a missing piece.
Mm.
So I think those two those two could usefully feed into one another as a way of refining both, well, as a way of describing what we're doing in the benchmarking and a way of refining what we do and how we think about the commons.
Yeah. And so my apologies, Mark. Yes, the NIH Data Commons was very much a stack, a really well-defined stack, and I consider that a specific implementation of a commons that would have all of these metrics associated with it. So yeah.
Karen, Francois, her hand up.
Yep. Thank you, Francois. I think you're muted. Yeah.
I would like to go back to something I talked about the other day also, which is that in the EOSC FAIR working group, we were tasked to discuss metrics for FAIR in the EOSC. And one of our recommendations is that we make a proposal with a set of metrics with several steps, and the metrics are coming from the FAIR data maturity model ones, criteria, I mean, and we propose, our recommendation is that there is an international discussion on those metrics in the framework of the GORC. So I don't know if it can be part of a benchmarking, but it's something which we think is really needed to be done and to begin relatively quickly.
And specifically, sorry, Francois, I didn't catch exactly what you said is the gap that needs to be focused on?
Yes, the point is that we were asked by the EOSC Executive Board to define metrics to measure fairness.
Okay.
And the point is that we have extracted from that FAIR data maturity model recommendation a subset of their proposed criteria that we think are really at the core of what is needed for EOSC. We have not taken up the whole model, but only some of the criteria, thinking about what EOSC should be. And we really think that this should be discussed at the international level, because as you know, metrics can be very dangerous, and we would like to get as much agreement as possible on them. So the place we thought was the right place to discuss this was the GORC.
Okay. And that link Karen put in the chat, is that the correct link to that?
Yes, I spoke about that in the meeting of the FAIR data maturity model the other day. So,
and so just to make sure,
yes, it's exactly that one. Yes, it's that one. And we have to propose the final recommendation will be written soon, because we got a significant amount of comments on it, and we have to finish the document now. And it's one of the recommendations of the document.
And so, Francois, just to make sure I'm understanding, are you saying that we are redundant, or that we should be?
No, we won't help.
You want help? Okay.
We won't help because it's so delicate. It's so delicate to define metrics that we think that they have to be thought and we think they have to be thought about in the international context to understand if all the commons can agree on a set of metrics to measure fairness.
Okay. And that's to measure fairness.
Fairness of that, in the document we discuss fairness of many things, but it's fairness of data in this case.
Okay.
And I suspect some of those fairness elements in that EOS context would intersect here, Karen, no doubt.
No doubt. And I'm just worried about, you sound like you're on a deadline for your deliverables that sounds quite soon, if I'm not mistaken.
No, but the deliverable just make the recommendation that it is done in the GORC context. We do not ask GORC to give us a blessing on the metrics. We are not crazy. You would have been welcome to comment. I should have sent a request for comment.
Okay. Edith, did you have something?
Yes, I just came in the right moment. I think that I very much support Francoise with the metrics for the GORC. I think that this is why I decided to come and join to the conference today. I think that it's a very important element which shouldn't be forgotten. And to see actually in the last few days in the several workshops that how the FAIR maturity model kind of built into the several other projects. I think that this is really inspirational on one side, but shows also that how generic tool it became.
Yeah, no, it was a great piece of work for sure. Yep.
And we wish to support it from the FAIR Data Maturity Working Group. I think that the European document which was done by the team led by Francoise, it's really a kind of focusing it to the direction of infrastructure. So it's a bit moving away from the original goal, and it's focused more on the infrastructure you have to use it for. So I think that it's very supportive. And I don't know, Francoise, if we can share the document already, or it's still yet not the final
The document, you know, there is a link to the document which is in the chat.
Okay,
Because
so you shared it.
It's the second draft, it's not the final one. But
because many people ask me also, but I was not sure if it is available. And
if people have to understand it's still a draft, but the draft is available.
Yeah.
I've linked it into the collaborative notes also.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Karen, at the risk of picking on somebody, I'm going to pick on somebody, and as Shahira Care's on the call, and she's the kind of lead analyst in this new Canadian DRI organization doing work and looking at doing a lot of research and analysis on international data platforms and commons. Shahira, I don't know if you wanted to comment about the work you've done or any challenges you might see given the work you've done for Indrio. And you don't have to. As I said, I'm picking on you. So when I pick on somebody, you don't have to read.
Or you can pick on me. Can you hear me? I'm actually joining from my cell phone. So
yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of the work that a working group that Indrio, which Mark is referring to, has been doing to kind of set the foundation for this new organization in Canada is looking at kind of international comparators, and then also defining for our own benefit what do metrics look like. And so I think that there's a significant benefit, from this work to benefit the different organizations. I like the idea of grounding it in FAIR. I'm not sure that the FAIR principles cover everything that we might be interested in measuring, though, but I think it's a good suggestion.
Thanks, Shahira. Yeah, because I've just given Shahira's last comment about not everything. Karen, you mentioned, I don't know if it was cycles or
Right.
some aspect.
Cycles or, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, because that's probably, is that an example of something that wouldn't necessarily intersect with the FAIR piece?
I mean, I don't necessarily see it. Yeah, I think some of them are going to be a little bit more pedestrian and just talk about, usage metrics that may or may not reflect FAIR. I mean, I suppose you could make the inference that if there's a large demand for your services, then people see them as trustworthy. But it's not a direct correlation, I don't think. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Does anyone have any comments about sort of the general approach that we talked about? The idea of creating a target list of commons, reviewing the public-facing documents, reviewing community associated documents like the FAIR work that Francois has talked about, doing some interviews. Does that seem like a rational approach? And then, of course, along with what Mark said, making sure that it's aligned with the topology of the commons that the interest group is working on. Is there anything I'm missing in that workflow that anybody wants to
And as a reminder, that list of 5 items is, somebody captured the slide. It's at the bottom of the second last page in the meeting notes.
Andrew's so helpful. That's just.
I don't know. I just like to maybe mention the minimum viable product approach again, which was developed by Eric Ries for the startups first, and I think that it helped a lot the EOS procedure itself. Yeah, you can read the many articles are about the minimum viable products, and I think that it should be the driver, because it will create the absolute minimum necessary things to done without all the heavy parts.
I think I agree that I tend to think about minimum viable products, but I think we could talk about metrics and let the commons decide what they are going to have develop, what they want to develop as a minimum viable product for their commons. I think.
I agree.
Rather than telling them that in order to be a commons, you have to have this, this, and this. Like, I'm not interested in saying that because
I agree.
Yeah, okay. And I'll just call myself out on this. I do think that there is one thing missing from the work plan, which would come across probably that we don't have a plan for the outputs, to socialize the outputs, to deliver to where they should live, to how they should be disseminated, how they should be presented. I mean, I have this idea in my head of this, dual list of benchmarks, but then beyond that, I don't have a good plan for it. So I think part of the work plan of the working group would be to create some sort of distribution plan for the outputs. And that would include, casting for comments and incorporating community review. But I do think that's missing, but I should add that.
Andrew and then Mark, I think, have their hands up.
So I don't normally disagree with Karen because she's way smarter than me and is able to function at 5 a.m. in the morning, which is a source of deep and ongoing envy for me. But I wonder whether we could take the idea of a minimum viable product and apply it maybe in the interest group to the idea of a minimum viable commons. What's the bare minimum of stuff that you need to have in order to call it a commons? Is just having somewhere to store data enough? Yeah, maybe not. Is just having a compute cloud enough? Maybe not. I mean, maybe you could say that in order to call yourself a commons, you have to have at least 3 of these 5 things. So I guess all I'm arguing for, Karen, is that we don't dismiss the idea of a minimum viable commons out of hand. I note from Francoise that in the chat that there's this idea of the minimum viable EOSC, which they're pursuing quite hard in Europe. I'd like to play with that idea a little bit longer and see where it takes us.
No, I think that's good. And I think that's a really good thing for the interest group to be focused on.
And you just on this one, I think that the minimum viable for global is maybe a more thin layer than for the regional, because the regional is for heavy use, yeah, but you do not wish to connect everything in the global. So for me, the global minimum viable product could be different than the regional one.
So you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, that it could be quite easy to define a minimal viable product for the global commons, even because we won't be connecting all of the services.
Maybe it's not easier to define, because actually you have to really minimize it.
Right.
But what I wanted to say, that probably it's different than for the regional one, because the regional is for massive use for all the domains, and you do not necessarily wish to interconnect everything at the global level.
Right.
Therefore, for me, it's just different, yeah. And
Yeah.
I guess it's a thinner, or it's less.
And I think what you're saying is very much aligned with the output from the interest group, which is a roadmap for the commons. So I think being able to focus in on what the community believes is a minimum viable product for the global commons could be an output of it. Could be the work on benchmarking is designed to feed into that, and we don't know what that minimum viable product is yet. But yes, but that roadmap would have to define that.
Yes, exactly. That's what I mean.
Yep.
Yeah. But and maybe we have to. Yeah, for me, I'm a politician originally, but I think that for the global commons are very important for the public investor, and in this case, these are the ministries, these are the government, these are the policymaker layer, because finally they provide the investment. Yeah, so for me, it's a very important stakeholder community to make it ready for them, that they will like it, or that they will understand it.
Yep.
We see it in Europe with the European Open Science Cloud now, that it's at the moment is discussed by the ministries, and how different questions the ministries ask about the European Commons than the experts.
And so your point is that the presentation has to be readable and useful to a politician, to the funding or the national funding bodies. Is that sort of?
Yeah, because finally they are the ultimate investors. Yeah, so they have to get it. Yeah, they have to understand it.
Okay.
This is Shelley. Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah, sure.
Hi, Shelley.
Hello. I can't seem to get my video turned on, so I'm not going to try. What I'm understanding you to say, and I'm kind of a little giddy, is we're having a really hard time, especially in the US, defining what a repository is. That might seem funny, but it seems like you're stepping back and saying, well, let's redefine it. Let's call it a commons, where you're actually providing services to researchers and meeting the needs of a variety of stakeholders. And that's what we mean when we're supporting the scientific ecosystem, is this thing. Does that seem about right?
So I'm less clued into the conversations you're having about how to define a repository. I do think, in my mind, and maybe I'm alone on this, but a repository would be part of a commons. I think of the commons as being, either nationally or domain specific coordination mechanism above it, so that there's an organizing committee and a set of shared values that develop a commons together, of which a data repository would be part of it. All of which should be in service to researchers, if I hear what you're saying correctly.
Yeah. So like a community, a way for a community, a domain potentially defined in different ways to come together, and this is where their data goes, this is where their software goes, this is where their standards are, this is how they make a change to their standards, this is something like that.
Sure.
Yeah. Sarah wants to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, Shelley, I think a commons is a bit broader than a repository. So a repository is part of a commons, but the commons is like a collective of multiple different infrastructures. So it could be repositories from different communities. It could be the different architecture and systems they have. So like PID infrastructure as well. And the commons, I mean, it could actually be defined just for one community. So it could be like an Earth Science Commons, or it could be something that crossed multiple domains. So I think when we're thinking about it, we're thinking about initiatives like EOSC or like the NIH Data Commons. So it's kind of bringing together multiple different services and is more of like a federated infrastructure.
Okay, that really helps. Thanks.
Karen, I think Mark Dietrich has his hand up.
Mark and then Kelly, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, a couple points. We were talking about minimum viable products or platforms, roadmaps, etc. I think it's probably going to be important, and also the work plan, it's probably going to be important to divide it into two pieces. For those who are not watching, I've got my two hands up. The first piece is going to be a bit zoological. We're just going to, we're just going to identify the creatures that are out there and try to characterize them. You know, do they have spots on their wings? Do they have 6 legs, 4 legs, 8 legs, etc.? I think we need to do a bit of that. And this kind of speaks to Shelley's comment, because there's an awful lot of words being used. There's an awful lot of commonality amongst the different activities. But when you, so for example, if you look at the Earth Science Grid Foundation and see how they thought about themselves and have been thinking about themselves for, you know, I don't know when they started, but it's like 10, 15 years. You know, they certainly didn't think of themselves as creating a research commons in their domain, but this is where we're trying to kind of slot them in. So they may not see themselves either as just this data thing or as a compute thing. And we need to let them speak about how they align themselves both with the stack and with the KPIs and with the services. And we're just going to do some, I would suggest just some identification of the flora and the fauna that are out there. We also need, from a work plan standpoint, to allow them to reflect on how they rise in our taxonomic characterization, and sort of thumbs up, thumbs down on that, and say, no, we have, you know, maybe we have aspirations to do more computational services in support of the data that we are holding, or vice versa. We thought of ourselves as being very computational, but now we want to position ourselves with more of a data layer. So some of it may be aspirational as opposed to factual. And then we can go on and say, well, how do the Sesame Street part, and for those of you who are not familiar with Sesame Street, that's 3 of these things are not like the other. And you do a little bit of comparing and contrasting to see how things are different and how things are the same. And use that to come around to Edith's point about the minimum viable product, or, you know, what might be potentially a starting point that all of these organizations, all of these activities might agree to. Say, yeah, I am a global open research commons that does these pieces of the bigger picture, and we see we can see ourselves in this description. And I think that identification is going to be an important piece of this, in terms of allowing people to say, yeah, I see myself in the GORC view, and therefore I'm prepared to be a part of the activities to bring more services together, more platforms together, as well as to collectively move the initiative forward. So hopefully that was helpful. And I do see Sarah talking about federation. There, federation in itself is a wrought term, an easily used term. We reached out, we did a quick survey at EGI about federations, research federations around the world, and we came up with 25 examples. And the fact of the matter is, many of them are very basic. And I think the same might be found in a lot of the things that you have in your list of examples. So, what is there? What few things are there? And then how do we give people a roadmap to build more things on in an effective way? So that's all.
No, I think it's smart. I think it's absolutely smart. And I think that the ability for them to position themselves as they are viewed is going to be important for going forward.
Karen, could we get Christoph to comment a little bit more about his comment about the key is the ability to exchange info?
Before we get Christoph, I think there was Kelly wanting after. Did Kelly have her hand up after Mark?
I don't think we have a Kelly, do we?
What am I? Okay, but I'm making people up. So then go ahead, Christoph, sorry.
Well, it's not a big thing. Just the fact that 2 or 3 individual infrastructures are federated doesn't make them a common from my point of view. So there needs to be more. And actually, I think there needs to be a description of some kind of service level that has to be reached, and not just the fact that something has been connected.
Yeah, and Andrew's going to say something to me about, there's Leggett mentioning the smart API again, but to my mind, this all raises what I'm continually amazed that this smart API concept that the NIH funded with their data commons hasn't gotten more traction, because to my mind, it's essentially that. It's a standard open API based way of describing the services that you provide, who the primary contact is, you know, where are the endpoints, what, you know, it's a way of consistently describing a set of services that may well function in some way together in the global open research commons or regional or whatever the case may be. So I've always thought it was a kind of a foundational concept or way to create what is in essence a registry of services in a common. So just to mention that again in this context, and maybe I'm misconstruing what Christoph is suggesting, but I think the function of that smart API is indeed to describe the nature of your services in a consistent, machine actionable way.
Yeah, I think I missed earlier. Did you want to say something? Shelley?
For those wondering what Mark's talking about, I provided a link to the NIH Smart API Registry, which has got following on links to more background on that if you want to read up on it.
Yep. So circling back to Shelley, if you got anything you want to add, or else we can move on to Sarah's comment.
Oh, thank you so much. No, I'm new to this conversation, so this will be really helpful. We have cultural issues around this, and it will take some folks some time to align, but I think it's worthy. One of our big issues, and I've had multiple conversations this week with, we have domain repositories, we have institutional repositories, we have general repositories, we have curation support at a domain level that does not scale well. Institutional repositories are not well appreciated. The ones that have put together the services that are necessary, not all of them have. And how do you know the difference? And then the general repository, which is quick but useless when it comes to supporting a researcher and curation. Not all of them, some do a good job, many don't. And there's no, and when you say to a researcher, find your, talk to your community and use the best repository, the concept of the commons is really what we're looking for, a place where the researcher has everything they need and they don't have to desperately hunt for support. That it's like you introduce them to their, hello, thank you for becoming a researcher, here's your commons. I really love this idea.
And I do think that the nuts and bolts of that are emerging and to be honest, a little bit daunting as we start to look at the idea that if what you're talking about is that a researcher has a single pathway, either through a virtual research environment or through a notebook, where they can discover data, pull in data, write code, publish to the publisher with a DOI, get access to high performance compute cycles. Like, I think that's sort of where we're trying to go. It's an elephant that we're gonna have to eat one set at a time, though, for sure, I think. And I do see this as a sort of a framework to move towards that. So let's see. All right, Sarah, did you want to say something about the value systems?
Yeah, sure, I can do. So just what I'd put in chat is that I think commons is more than the technology. So I think if we look at like EOSC as an example, there's a whole suite of materials that go beyond the technical implementation. So things around the governance, things around how you manage the community, what your rules of participation are. And but like personally, my view of the commons, if I look back at like work from Eleanor Ostrom or others, I think it really has to be about a set of shared values and why people are coming together and what that kind of social contract is. So I think, was it Christoph who'd said, you know, you can federate two infrastructures, but that doesn't make a commons. I would completely agree. It's not just about this technical interoperability. It's about all of that social side as well. And it has to be much more of a collective thing and a, you know, a consensual thing and something that's governed by the people that it's serving. But I don't know to what extent everyone else has that same view. But I think a commons has to be a more thoughtful and mindful effort. It's not just about technical integration.
Good point.
Yep, that's why Sarah's here, because I can't talk in those words.
I can only talk in those words because I started wine with dinner.
Sarah, is that an example of the kind of thing that is incorporated into the EOS discussion and rules of participation?
Yeah, so the rules of participation kind of have two sides to them. So what it means to be a user of EOS, what the kind of commitments are on you in terms of the way that you act, but also what it means to be a service provider. And some of those are, you know, technical requirements, like your service has to have a certain readiness level or certain meet certain standards or be trusted or be sustainable or conform to certain standards. But yeah, I mean, what I would like to see more in the EOS discussion is that it's a collective thing, that it's a community-based thing. At the moment, I think it's focusing way too much on service providers, and I don't think we've done enough engagement with the user communities or having those user communities in the governance. So that's something I pushed quite hard for when I was setting up the FAIR working group, that we had researchers, we had representatives from different groups, because I think if the people you're serving aren't involved in that building of it, I think it can be quite problematic, because you know, you can very easily be disconnected. And I think what I like from Eleanor Ostrom's work is that, well, there she's looking at things like, you know, common land, you know, so like shared orchards or whatever. And it's something that's the community's defining the ways in which it works, and the community has a stake in it. And I think that's the best way for us to go in terms of building these data commons, because it ultimately has to serve the users and it has to be something that they're bought into.
It was funny listening to you. Your talk reminded me of some of the conversations in the various personalities I've taken over the last few years regarding our Shibboleth Federation, if you will. And, you know, you've got identity providers and service providers, and, you know, there's an agreement between those folks that in exchange for these identities, you, the service provider, you know, will meet these, not just provide these functions, but meet these basic policy elements in order to be you know, an agreed upon service provider.
Yeah, there was an interesting point that came up yesterday. There was a interest group around like organizational interoperability. It was like the social aspects of interoperability, and they gave the example of the AgriFed community in Australia, which has been supported by ARDC, and how they ensured that they had people not just in the governance, but in the implementation side. So everyone who's a member of that AgriFed consortium had to have people who were involved in the steering and in the delivery. And they used two words, and I can't remember what it was. It wasn't steering and delivery. It was some other nice comparison of the two. And I think, again, that's really important. You've got to have the people who are involved and who are benefiting from this involved in all aspects to make sure that it is built in the way that meets their needs.
Yeah.
I'd like very much, Edith, I'd like very much to support the idea which Sarah just said about the rules of participation. We see more and more in Europe where the legislation just opened, because we have the free flow of data legislation, we have the open data information, which oblige the sharing data among the countries. And actually now we see more than ever before that the legislation alone will not make it open. Yeah, the organizations themselves are very closed, and they are very close by the rules of participation and the rules of procedures, whatever you call them in the institution. So actually, I came last week to the conclusion that maybe we have to think about the new open principle. And open principle, I really mean open. Open would stand for me, the organization. P would stand for the policies, both privacy and property rights, because these are the two major ones. E would stand for me very much the ecosystem when you are going out to the third party. So there are multiple users who were not in the first round to agree. And the N would stand for me the networks, basically those who agree the common set of rules and ethical values to behave similarly. And I have got a conclusion after the EOSC symposium, following all the meetings, that how much it became a next problem to solve, that maybe it's a good idea. That's what I try to promote, to set up the open working group to sort this out. Yeah, again, organizations, policies, ecosystems, and the networks based on the charter to work together. I'd like to say something more, which is maybe indirect, but I think that the GORC started its work in the super good time when the world is opening. I think that after the US election, the world is moving back from the risk of being bilateral or tripolar world to the multilateral discussions. And therefore, for the science which is just in the transition to be more global and more open, it's just an opportunity to be somehow in this multilateral table and inspire the global leaders in a way which we never could do before. Yeah, sorry, it's again the politician speaking, but I think that those who have to sit back to the multilateral table after this cold period, how to say, they are looking for wonderful ideas that they can agree. And this is just a wonderful idea to agree. And maybe we have to somehow get the way to be visible for them.
I like your optimism. Honestly, I think it's great.
Yeah. No, I believe, and I am part of the transatlantic dialogue. Yeah, we just had a discussion this week and last week several times with the U.S. leaders, with the U.S. transition. The people who prepared the transition. I think that there is a hope, and yeah, the alternative is not bearable. Yeah, so as the Russian joke said, that what are the ways for the intellectual in Russia? One is that you became alcoholic, and the other one is that you die. Yeah, so it's everyone went to drink because they could not really speak. Yeah, so
yeah.
Wait, I missed the joke. Somebody has to say that again to me because I missed it. What was it?
No, so the question was that what are the two ways for the Russian intellectual, and one way is that you become a drunk, and the other one that you become a suicide. So which one you choose? Yeah, everyone went to drink. Yeah, so
I have a feeling this is where Edith's pushing us by making open an acronym. We're all going to be
yes,
it doesn't mean open.
Yeah, open is the right acronym. Yeah, I mean, I was part to break down the Iron Curtain, and I am from the seamless move of everything. Yeah,
that's great.
Mark, Karen, this has been a fantastic conversation, but it was notionally the first half hour of this meeting. Do we want to look at the actual text of the case statement?
Yep, we can do that. So,
or we can keep this and just let people attack the case statement after the meeting.
So I learned, I don't know if it was Mark that said it last week. I learned this phrase martyr document last week, where you set the document up to be shredded. Essentially.
Martyr document, yeah.
Yeah. So either way, I went over the essentially the components of the case statement. I'm happy to walk through them up there, but everyone should be able to add comments on it. And I had gotten some comments from the interest group on Tuesday that I've already incorporated. So
yeah, and that was, if you go to the bottom of page 3 in the notes document, there's a set of questions that are either a comments and notes or binary yes, no. And going ahead with Andrew's suggestion, the first question was, do you agree with the kind of high level statements of work that Karen described in those kind of that two-part model? And then the second question is whether yes or no, are there changes you think would be reflected in the elements in the draft case statement? So that was certainly our goal, was to get folks to provide some initial feedback on either those two high-level statements of work that Karen highlighted in the deck, or specific elements of the case statement. So just people can, do you want to just let people take a look at that and add comments for 5 minutes or so, Karen?
Yeah, however folks want to do this, I'm fine with that. Let me just pull it up 1 second. Yep. So the charter essentially starts with a definition of the commons, not the definition that was floated earlier this week. So this document was written sort of simultaneously as we were working on that definition. But it's just a recognition of the fact that the vision for the Global Open Research Commons, the currently who we see building the commons, the deliverables from the interest group, and that we are interested in supporting one of the outputs from the interest group, which is a roadmap for development by collecting benchmarks. And then it goes in and describes the 2 deliverables, the KPIs and the benchmarks that, and Mark, I think, said earlier, rightly so, that it's a combination of technical infrastructure and human infrastructure. And the value proposition, why we think it's a good idea, both for the funders and for the developers, and for the people who are wanting to create this ambitious vision. And then it talks a bit about some of the related work, which we absolutely should be including the EOSC fair data draft that was put out that Francois talked about. And then the work plan, which I'm now going to add a section on creating a distribution plan for the outputs. And then the working group, which, this may be less time than I think, but probably not, given the fact that everyone does everything voluntarily and off the side of their desk. So I think giving ourselves until April 2022 is probably a good idea.
Well, and the other thing, Karen, I think with an effort like this is that, if it's articulated in the right way, it may lend itself to, an organization or 2 providing some more substantial support to work on the detail.
Yep.
And
yeah.
Something we should support.
If we can identify essentially significant bridges or significant portions that need to be developed further, is that interesting, Mark? Yeah. Yeah.
Francois?
Yes. How would you see where what I am proposing would fit in this description? Because, I have the impression it would have to go in a specific task force somehow. I have a feeling it's much more focused than what you plan to do in this working group. When I see the description, maybe I'm wrong.
You see, I'm sorry. You see this working group as being more broadly scoped than what you had hoped. Is that what I'm?
No, I have the impression that you have a very wide scope, because if you want to benchmark all the elements of such complex systems, it's a huge task. And I am not completely sure that with this broad scope, you will be able to go in the kind of details we need if we want to ask ourselves questions about the details of criteria to be fair with respect of a point of view of a commons or the EOSC or other commons. So I am not completely sure it fits, but maybe it can go in more details in some cases than what I feel you plan to do in what I read in the document.
But I think it fits, Francois. I think at the very least it fits with that Section 3 engagement with existing work. Because whether we do, intersect directly and help facilitate the work of that group, or we learn from the work of that group, I'm not sure which is more appropriate.
I mean, I think it's a fair point there, Francois, that it could, it could be that I am approaching this rather naively and thinking that we will be able to identify features and metrics based on the organizations that are building commons that we've identified up front. There may be a level of detail that we chose not to engage in, and then if we don't do that, is it not useful? I think is it absolutely?
I think that I understand very well the general metrics you would like to establish. I understand that, and I have nothing against it. I'm just wondering how a very specific aspect of the wool commons on which there would be a need to have international agreement, to have it working properly, I mean, and to have also some checks of what is proposed. I am not completely sure that it fits in the description. This is my point.
Can you give me an example of something that you think a type of detail that we would need to come to agreement on that it's not included in this description?
I don't know. You know, what I am saying is that I have a list of criteria for fairness, and I would like to see if the other comments agree that it's good or what other comments on it, and can we agree on a common list? Do you see this as fitting with what you want to do?
I'm wondering if we have two different goals. So it feels like you want metrics for fairness.
Yes.
And the proposal is about metrics for engagement. And am I wrong?
Yes.
Yeah.
This is what I wrote in the chat. What I am worrying about, or what I am tasked to think about, is metrics for fairness, and it's not metrics for engagement.
Right.
So I don't think that what I propose goes in the general overview of what it means to be a commons. It's eventually one of the things on which there could be an agreement between commons to do so, to align on some of the things which are inside, which is a bit different. This is why it could be in your part B, but I think it may be even too specific for your part B.
But I understand the distinction you're trying to make, Francoise, but I think what Sarah's proposed in chat, which I've dumped into the notes, is correct, that the fair metrics that you're developing in EOSC might be one of the kinds of things that we recommend through the benchmarks as good practice to apply across all commons. So in other words, the EOSC activity on fair metrics is developing a particular approach that we can then say, okay, this is best practice, good practice, however you want to describe it, for assessment of fair metrics. Let's now see how the other commons elements rank against that. And you might find that another country or another commons has done a really good job on identifying metrics for sustainable data repositories. Let's take those and use those as best practice across the other things. So I think we can have metrics developed in different places that we then tie together as part of an international benchmarking activity.
Yes,
Yeah,
but this means it's not a validation of the metrics. It's taking them and saying it's okay. You know, you do not include a discussion of the proposed metrics.
I think it could go both ways, Francois. So, so certainly within EOSC, I mean, we had a task to define the fair metric. So we've done that. I don't know in the other commons, like in ARDC, I mean, you've got that fair assessment tool. So you definitely have done some work in that space, and others may well be defining a set of metrics around the digital objects and assessing them. So I think in some cases it could be a validation, because it might be that multiple commons initiatives are working on similar topics. In other cases, it might just be that one is further forward on something than others, and essentially that work is taken as a recommendation, and then maybe it's implemented in the others and tested, and we get some feedback that way. But I think within this, that there's lots of things that need to be benchmarked, because the commons itself has lots of different facets to it. And I think identifying a couple of points where we already have some activity or content like the FAIR metrics as a good starting point, because then you can have 2 or 3 things that you test within this working group, and then you can iterate out onto the other aspects.
It can allow to define a method to work around these things also, to take a few examples, as you say. Not many, but 1, 2, 3 with different aspects, and to see if a method can be defined to deal with that on other aspects.
So I'm just gonna, just because I don't want to miss it, and I want to make sure that we get a sense from folks. So, you know, commenting on the draft case statement, I think is something that people can do, and hopefully over the next little bit. Just to get a sense, so and Andrew has discovered the feature at the bottom of the participants list, or knows it well, where you, over on the left-hand side at the bottom of the participants column, you've got a yes or no. So I'm just going to kind of run through these 3 binary questions just to make sure we get at them, because we do want to kind of have a closure before the final plenary event. So is there general agreement that the high-level SAO is an appropriate driver for the deliverables? Additional comments and finessing aside. So you can click the yes or no at the bottom of your participants list in response to that one.
I don't see them showing up on when people respond, Mark, unless they're doing it.
If you open up the participants panel, you should. You've got like 5 or 6 yeses now. I don't know as hosts and co-hosts whether you're able to vote. You might not have the options to do it.
Yeah, we can, but so yeah, you have to open the participants list, Karen, and you'll see there's a green circle to the right of everybody's name.
Okay.
So
maybe
no no's so far.
No. So I'll take that as a general consensus that with further work and tweaking, that the high-level statement of work.
How to vote? I do not know how to vote. Okay, yes, I saw.
You see it now. If you open up the participants, you have a series of buttons. You can also say, I need a coffee break on that, and the more options.
And you'll also notice, and maybe it's just Karen and I that have it, but I'm going to clear them all, because I think there was a clear consensus that we're going in the right direction. The other question is, do they seem doable in the time frame that Karen presented? And as a reminder, Karen, that was it April 22?
Yep.
For the final deliverable. But again, if you want to do a yes or no. And at this point, I'm just seeking the responses to the binaries, because a no would suggest that we may need to, and it's in the context of the high-level statement of work being doable in the time frame. If somebody feels that it's not, there's too much, then we would have to do some refining.
I don't want to vote yes or no. I think that I would like to say that there can be a general assessment on general things, and then if we go into the details for some topics, the topics will have to be focused.
Right.
Otherwise, I don't think it can work in the time frame. But
Yeah,
it's my personal opinion. I cannot vote yes or no on that.
So my comment, Francoise, and maybe this helps you or not, is that the scope is actually quite elastic. And I think we'll be able to do something by April the 2022. Is it everything that could be done? No. Will it be useful? Yes. So I think we may just have to adjust our ambitions as we get a better sense of how large the task is.
Maybe there is a need to include at some point near the beginning, after a few months, for instance, a point of review of the topics, the detailed topics which will be discussed and dealt with in the second part of a working group. It's just to try. I am thinking also about the tab review. And I think that to have
Yeah,
a
me
meeting
too.
point at some point to understand what will be dealt with in details, what is feasible, where you have people to do the job and so on. I think it would be helpful.
Yeah.
Not to try to embrace everything.
So Francois, did you have and I'm looking at the schedule. Are you saying there should be a tab review
No, the tab review, you will get it at the beginning.
at the beginning?
Yeah. Francoise is just trying to anticipate what terrible people like her and me will do on tab once we rotate off.
And we will not be there, so we can speak because we will not be there. So there is no conflict of interest at this stage. But you see, I would include, if you go to the table with a timeline, I would put maybe around the time. So sometimes during the first semester of next year, a meeting point to decide the eventual detailed topic that will be dealt with in the next, in the last step of a working group for the external benchmarks or internal, well.
So Francoise, you mean after the literature review and before the begin outreach phase? Yeah, exactly where you put your cursor, Karen.
Yes, I would say meeting point to decide to consolidate the list of topics which will be dealt with in detail, something like that.
Yeah, and I think the way we would describe that to our future tab colleagues, Francoise, is that we need to do some scoping work. We have a broad sense of what we're trying to do, and we need to do some further scoping work to identify the kind of the 12 months of work. So 6 months of scoping and then 12 months of more focused activity, and I think that would be fine.
Yes, and also to take into account the volunteers who have knowledge in different topics when you are sure you have the team to do the job.
And that the team can provide the required amount of effort within the time span you have allocated. Yes, exactly.
So have I accurately captured that in the January to June timeframe, and that should be at the top?
Yeah, I'll stick some words in.
Okay.
That's great.
I can tell you that in the Fair Data Maturity Working Group, the first 6 months, which we call the definition, and ended with the session to define what we are doing and what we are not going to do. Even it would be important, but we are not able to deal with it. Yeah, so we delisted some of the activities which we could not do in the framework and the time frame. And I think it was the most efficient step in our work in the FD working group.
Yes, 18 months is very short. We know that.
We know. Well, we could do it as a phase 1 and a phase 2.
Yeah, I think you could adjust the scope as you go, because I think there's been the comment that Mark put in the chat was also really useful. Which I'm just going to have to scroll back up to it.
Survey.
Mark Dietrich?
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a good approach.
Yeah, I was a little worried by the desk research activity. I realize some of that needs to be done, but Shahira made the same comment in the document. The reality is you're just not going to see quite enough granularity in public documentation. So to some extent, you're going to want to create a wish list, and you'll ideally validate it a little bit with a few guinea pigs, and then push it out to all the organizations and clearly position it as, establish the mandate, if you will, and why you're doing this, so that people will respond well. I know that, for example, Andrew, Steve Kinnett did something like this for on behalf of ARDC, reaching out to different federations around the world and gathering some information about how they federate themselves. And that took quite a long time. So, you know, even when you've got a clear focus and a short list, it can eat up some resources.
I think that I think what you're saying is true. I think that my fear is that I think people are over surveyed. Like if we just set up an instrument and ask for the Commons to respond, I feel like it just really puts a huge burden on people, which is why I'd rather do the desk research with some targeted questions to different Commons, and then do some one-on-one outreach to those Commons. Hopefully we can whittle down again, it would be part of the scoping to figure out if we need to whittle down either the list of Commons that we want to approach or the metrics that we're trying to get at or something along those lines. But
okay, fair enough. Yeah.
Would you like some cheese and crackers?
So I'm going to assume that the answer to the last yes or no is should the working group be established?
No, it's clearly it's a terrible idea. That's why we've spent so long time.
Feel free to say yes or no, but I also note that most of the people, except I think Michelle, was dealing with Barker children heading off to school. But I think she's the only person that doesn't have a yes in the signed up for the email.
I'll lobby her.
There you go. So,
I mean, she lives 2,500 kilometers away from me, so my ability to pressure her is very limited, but I'll do what I can.
All right. So I'll pass it over to you, Karen, because I think maybe I'm not sure what you'd like to see as the next steps, but I'm assuming the finessing a final charter or a case statement for TAB.
So we'll leave the document open for a couple of days and finish it up, then submit it to the TAB. And then I can either set out a doodle poll for the idea of reconvening. I think of it as being a monthly meeting would make sense. If that's the way forward, if people think. And I'm not familiar with the TAB process, Andrew, so maybe you can.
Once that step first.
So the TAB process is once you've come up. Sorry, once I have to stop doing this. It's going to be. I won't be on TAB very soon. Once this group has come up with a case statement we're happy with, we submit it to TAB, and TAB will assign reviewers. Those reviewers will do separate reviews. TAB will meet to agree on a consolidated review, and then that consolidated review will come back to us. It will either say, terrible idea, go away, which I think we've almost never done. Yes, we like it, but here are some tweaks, which is the usual response. And very occasionally, yep, that's great, we'll just endorse it straight to council. So I would anticipate that our TAB colleagues who have been well trained by me and Francoise will find ways to improve it. So I would anticipate, one cycle around that loop.
So I'll leave the case statement open for comments for 2 or 3 days. Mark and I will submit it to the TAB, and then we'll set up a mailing list to let folks know how it went. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Yep. Francois has made some comments in chat about community review. There's also a community review process in parallel.
And there's no reason, correct me, Andrew or Francois, if I'm wrong, but there's no reason, Karen, why you can't incorporate edits into the document and send an email to the people who had a yes here or that are signed up as members to attend the BoF at this plenary, that we're going to have a call to finalize this case statement.
Okay.
Yes, I think it would be good to have that, because I have a feeling the case statement can be improved, but maybe not. But it, as you have seen, it was good to discuss it. So yeah. I would really suggest that we have, even if we have enough Zooms, sorry, I think that it may be good to have another discussion. But I know the difficulty with the times and so on, so it's not easy.
Yeah, so that was the was the question that I was going to come to. Karen, you talked about a doodle poll for possible monthly meetings. I mean, I think that's a great idea. We're going to have time zones switching backwards and forwards over the course of the next 18 months. It's one thing we have to deal with. And while this time's great for me, I note that for my European colleagues, it's now coming up to midnight. So I'm not quite sure. I'm happy to start an hour earlier, which would make it a little bit more bearable for my European friends, but not so great for those of you on the west coast of the Americas. So I don't know. There is no good time when you're trying to involve people across this range of countries.
Yeah, I think, well, I personally am happy to take the hit of like a late night because I'm better at that time of day. But yeah, I think having a short thing that is not too inconvenient for most people is best. So this kind of time slot generally works, or an hour before.
Yeah, I'd be happy to go an hour earlier. That's only 7 in the
Yeah.
morning for me. That's fine.
And I think it's worth us trying to, give people a week or two to look through the case statement and then have another call to digest and make edits. Because I think if you submit it to TAB saying that you've had this feedback through the, through the plenary and then a follow-on call, it shows that it's more robust, that it's had more eyes on it and more inputs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'd agree.
So I think there's two things. I think one, Kathleen had a comment in the section about inclusivity. I just want to make sure she either captures that in the case statement, or if we need to talk about that now. We've got about 6 minutes left before this moves on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to me, a commons is about a place where everybody can participate. And what often we see is that the Global North defines the criteria for being able to enter into the commons, but then it's not a commons to me. If it's a commons, we have to talk about best practices, encourage, but then we also have to look at the capacity of all of those developing countries to be able to participate, because in the end, they need to, they can't be giving their data over to these commercial providers. They need to keep their data. They need to have to learn and build capacity in their countries. Mm-hmm. So I'm just very, very concerned that these discussions aren't driven only by, the people in the Global North who have a lot of resources. And so let's make sure that it really is a commons, because that's what a commons is. A commons is not, oh, we are the elite and we decide, who, and everybody else is excluded. So I'm just concerned about that. And, several of the meetings I've attended through this RDA, I know I've traveled a lot in developing countries in the last 2 or 3 years through CORE, and their models are very different. And so we need to consider those models in terms of how they fit into the commons. They need to attach their models into the commons, which right now they're not. They're being excluded from the discussions and the requirements, a lot of the discussions and requirements at RDA. So I guess that's what I want to urge us to consider and that to be part of this as we move forward.
I think that's a good point. And Shahira made a comment in the case statement that I've included, and based on your comment, as an example of a benchmark, we would include a mechanism for community engagement, an element of scale for inclusion, as an example. But I appreciate you highlighting that, Kathleen.
I'd like to come on here because two items. I think that Mark would agree with me that and Andrew, that the council is just working on the strategy, and we very much wish to focus as an RD on the global hemisphere and the global south and in the less developed world. So I think it's important. But on the other side, we cannot, as RDA, we will not cross the gap of the missing investment in the region. And this is why I said earlier that it's very, very important that we are able to somehow talk to the investors, and in this case, the governments in this world, and maybe the donors from the international development aid. And probably this is why we wish to use also the SDGs more to approach those donors, because those people have to listen and understand that what is the cost to do not include those countries. Especially in terms of research, we are talking about climate change and other where the data is in those places. So it's not only their problem that the data is not collected. It's a problem of the most developed part of the world that those capabilities are missing. So this is why I think that for the we should create something which is readable for understandable for the investors, both in the local governments and both the international donor agencies, which is very strong in Canada, for instance. I personally was 1 week in the ODE, which is your development agency in Austin. So I think that there are people we could talk, but for them we have to be able to explain what is the cost to do not have those commons.
But can I just give you an example? And I don't want to take us off into a tangent, but so there are now these requirements, policies. I was just in the policy meeting, that's why I came late here, but and now they're saying, oh, there's only these types of repositories that are acceptable to deposit into. So if there's only these types of repositories, which involve like, okay, Dryad Figshare and the big, Zenodo and the big North American and European repositories, then, then the researchers are never going to be incentivized to deposit in their own local repositories because they're completely cut out, because they're excluded from those policies. So it's a very important issue, and I've had very little. I've not been able to make inroads with those people who are talking about policies around why it's so important that they don't set the bar so high, because the point is that we're trying to develop capacity, and we want to encourage, like you said, Edith, we want to encourage funders in those countries to put more money into their local infrastructure. But if all of the policies that they're mirroring say, oh, just deposit in Figshare or Dryad or these large or Zenodo, then they're not going to put money into it.
It's not achievable. Yeah. I was a sales manager for the emerging market, so I know what you are talking about.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to take us.
Sorry, we need to. We're going to have to scoot because
yeah, the plenary's on, I think, just now.
The closure, yes.
Yeah.
But thank you all, and we're going to circulate. We're going to circulate an email to set up a meeting for the final draft. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your RDA. Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks for a great discussion.
Bye.